So we're here overlooking Brockwell Park in South London, and with Chris Idle, who is one of my predecessors as Rector of St Anne's. Chris, when I describe to people the history of St Anne's, I always date the recent history of St Anne's to 1976.
Well, I can see that was a turning point, but there were people there before me.
Of course. But just tell us, you brought a group from St Matthias to Limehouse in 1976. How did that come about?
I'll have to go back a little bit, because after I'd done 2 curacies, you mentioned Barrow just now, that was my first one, then in Peckham, and then, excuse me, after 2 curacies of 3 years each, I was ready for a move. And I think I must have been approached, as someone else was, there were 2 of us, about St Matthias Poplar, which is just down the road from Limehouse. And when I'd accepted, I was interviewed by the patrons and by the local church and offered the job. And when I'd accepted, 2 or 3 people, and I can't remember now who they were, said to me, "Oh, you must talk to John Pierce." John Pierce is the name. He was only, well, he wasn't quite 40 then. We're talking about 1971. And John has thought about strategy for the gospel in East London, and he's thought a lot about St Matthias Poplar. So I went to see John, and John told me 2 things. He said, well, first of all, he said, "Are you a conservative evangelical?" Well, it was some years since I'd heard that phrase. It wasn't always the way we talked. However, I could answer yes, I was a Bible-believing Anglican. He said, well, there are 2 things you ought to know. One is a problem you'll face, which you won't expect, to do with a particular person. Just be wary of that. But the second one is, I'm afraid, St Matthias has got no future. Well, that was a bit of a slap in the face.
You had just been appointed there.
That's right.
Yeah. First incumbents.
The Church of England will not persevere with little churches like that. The parish is too small. It's right bang next to All Saints Poplar, which is a big Anglo-Catholic parish that turns out bishops by the, not by the dozen, but often, anyway, it's a prestigious parish, and they will swallow up St Matthias. However, he said, this is 1971, do keep your eye on Limehouse, because that's where the future might be. Okay, so that was my starting point, and we worked and loved it in, well, most of the time, at St Matthias for 5 years, which was the term I was given. And I hoped, John Pearson said, even if you double the congregation or treble it, they'll still close you down. Well, I hoped he might be wrong, because we got settled there, and God blessed us, and we did increase, not 5-fold, but a little bit. And but then came 1976, and the big event then, I remember, no, in 75, was the then Rector of Limehouse, Charles Watts, announced he was retiring. So John Pierce, he was the first to know, of course, told me, keep your eye on that. Well, now, there followed a whole year of negotiation, discussion, prayer, meeting people, arguing. Oddly, I think a letter from the Methodist minister in Poplar to the bishop, Trevor Huddleston, kicked things along, because he suggested it might be good if Chris Idle went to Limehouse, which was, well, at least now it was in the area of discussion. Although then it didn't seem very likely. However, the factors were that Limehouse couldn't really find anyone who wanted to go there. It wasn't attractive in lots of ways. And I was an evangelical, and they hadn't been, well, the Church Council, PCC, at Limehouse passed a resolution that I didn't know till I got there and then read the minute books, all the minutes. And they passed a resolution, something like, we don't know what an evangelical is, and if we did, we wouldn't want him here. But that was engineered by, well, let's say a very tiny minority. I think the other members of the church council, who were a few and elderly and very faithful, but they were afraid that that they would close St Anne's because it had fallen into such a state, both physically and spiritually. So we talked about this. We talked about the deanery of Tower Hamlets, which was the borough of Tower Hamlets, probably still is.
Yes.
And then there were three evangelical churches, very clear evangelical. One was Christchurch Spitalfields, St James the Less, Bethnal Green, and Poplar. And the argument on our side was it wouldn't be right to close one down or stop it being evangelical and leaving only two evangelical churches in the deanery. So that was one argument. And I say, we prayed and we worked and we met the people of St Anne's, and in the end, by the grace of God, they accepted that most of them were glad to have anyone, even if he wasn't evangelical. You know, they'd keep the place open, willing to come here. One factor was that in a few years earlier, there had been a St Peter's Church Limehouse. The name still survives in the St Peter's Barge. But there was a church building, St Peter's, and they had had a merger with St Anne's, which had been a complete failure. Some were alarmed that another merger is going to come that we didn't really ask for. One big difference was the St Peter's merger. The St Peter's congregation lost their vicar and their building, and that was just too much. There were two or three only who were still coming to St Anne's when we went there, who were at St Peter's, but they soon dropped off, well, all except one actually, yes. But in our case, the fact was that although we were losing a building, it was St Anne's who were losing a vicar, so we each lost something but gained something. So in 1976, which is your turning point, I was instituted as Rector of St Anne's.
And tell us what the area dean said.
Well, this was a bit later on. We were having some celebration or other. I think we were meeting in the gallery then. There was nowhere else to meet with cups of tea and so on, and a few speeches celebrating whatever it was. And did I say the area dean? I think it was. Yes, it was. Who said, when I heard that Charles Watts, Rector of Limehouse, was, excuse me, retiring, I thought, well, only an idiot, only a lunatic would want to come there and be the rector. And then we heard that Chris Idler was interested. So here he is.
Amazing. So tell us, what did you find when you came to St Anne's in terms of the building and the congregation?
Well, although we found it, we knew what we were going to find because we'd walked on it. I remember going over it with Marjorie, my wife, and looking at it. Our first thought was, well, we can't ever come here. That was first reaction. It wasn't the only one. I mean, for example, there were 200 broken windows. We counted those. And pigeons were flying in and out and dying because they couldn't find a way out. There were dead pigeons. The faithful few members there had to mop up before every Sunday morning to get the smell out. It was really quite powerful. And the whole place was neglected, sadly. It wasn't the fault of the congregation. I think they didn't get the support they needed. But one thing we did, I know you haven't asked this question, but Tom Rummel, who as I speak now in 2023 has just passed away, gone to glory. He was a painter by trade, not an artist, but a house builder, a painter and decorator. I said to Tom, could you paint the main door bright red? It was black and filthy, and the fact that from day one we had a bright red door, just a sign that something was happening here, you know. The other thing was I rang the bell before every service so that they could hear the bell ring. And so that was it.
It was quite a task you let yourself in for. And in terms of heritage from that time, Rona's still going?
Yes, that's right. She was, I think when the PCC passed this anti-evangelical resolution, there was one abstention. Now, I never found out who abstained, but I just wonder if it was Rona.
Maybe she can tell us.
Well, I don't know whether she'd remember. Well, she might remember.
And
you can ask her.
And as we were driving over here, my son Tim is helping us with the recording today, and he said, ask Chris where the hot trolley came from. Do you know where the hot trolley came from?
It came from a school, I think.
Really? During your time?
I think, yes, I remember helping to carry it upstairs.
It's a beast.
I mean, yes.
Yeah. We're probably going to have to take it out one of these days. Maybe you can come and help
Well,
lift it up the steps.
I'm surprised it's still there.
It's still going. It's still going.
Well, we used it to serve meals, of course. Because of the architectural magnificence of St Anne, together with other churches designed by Nicholas Hawksmoor, who is, you know, is a pupil of Christopher Wren, St Paul's Cathedral. So we had groups. I had to get used to all sorts of people came to look at the organ and to look at the architecture. And I would give them a little welcome to the, you know, chat, and then they'd be off with their notebooks and studying the pillars and the roof and all this. And we hadn't been there very long when a group came from the Ashmolean Society in Oxford, that purely on the architecture. But one of the group happened to be married to a good old-fashioned evangelical clergyman. So she knew what was what. And as they looked around, she noticed the bookstall. And the bookstall, since we arrived, had got Bibles on it and books by John Stott and evangelistic little booklets and so on. You know, the kind of thing, I hope. And she sidled up to me as they wandered around and said, how long has this church been evangelical? And I said, 3 weeks. But the bookstore was one little mark, you know, that we wanted to make right from day one.
Yeah, yeah. What happened to the candlesticks?
Oh, well...
Because when you arrived, am I right in thinking you'd go into church and there would be a great big high altar, up several steps, in front of the east window, with whacking great candlesticks? Well,
everything took time. It didn't all happen straight away. Some were impatient and thought I should have been more drastic. Others appreciated the fact that you couldn't change everything straight away. But I was helped by the fact that there was a very high church vicar in central London, the West End in fact, who noticed that I'd been appointed to St Anne's, and he knew about me, the kind of person I was. So he thought, now this Chris Idle, he won't want all these statues and candlesticks.
Some of which had come from St Peter's.
Yes, in fact quite a few had. But I wouldn't mind those, so we'll see if we can do a deal. So with the Archdeacon's approval, he came over and collected a whole lot of, well, I wouldn't call it junk, but it wasn't very good material, but he wanted them for his church, and then his church burnt down. So that was the end of a lot of the stuff we got rid of to him. I had said at our first PCC, when we'd arrived at 76, I've said to them, now there are some things I have changed, full stop. I'm not going to argue about it, but they've got to be different from now on. They're different. There's a whole lot more which I've no intention of changing. We'll leave it purely as it is. And then there's a whole lot, another area where we can talk about it. For example, I said, I'm not all that keen on the statue of the Virgin Mary with crowns round her head at the front. And they said, well, nor are we. That had come from old St Peter's Limehouse. And they brought all their gear. And there were, I think, 5 different altars, as they called them, up in towards the East End. And again, with permission, legally, we got rid of well, all of them in the end. I should say that one step forward, though it was a slow one, was when we formed Care for St Anne's. At first we didn't seem to make much progress. We were always having meetings and reading long minutes of decisions made, but we didn't actually do very much in practical work. But one thing that did come from that was the discovery of this old table which was used to put the tea urn on, and one of our advisors who was on the committee said, well, I think this is a 17th century communion table. Wow! So that, with historic reason, became our communion table. Which
and we use it to this day, yes.
And it was polished at this chap's expense. He polished it up for us, and we did it.
It's still got scorch marks on it from the tea urn, but that's okay.
Well, okay, yes.
Yeah, yeah.
That's right, yes.
So when you came, I want to ask about the space that you had available for ministry, because it's an enormous building, but in the building at that time you didn't have toilets, you didn't have a kitchen, right. And you didn't really have a Sunday school room.
When the toilets finally came, one dear lady, Winnie Campbell, a saint, said, I don't know how we managed for 200 years without toilets. But of course, and that was opening the crypt room, because Care for St Anne's, which I've mentioned, the main idea was they would take the burden of the building off the PCC, so the church council could think about the gospel and the teaching of the church and evangelism, and not have to worry every meeting about how we're going to pay for this or do that. Care for St Anne's took that off us, and the great mercy of God was when the London Development Corporation decided we were just within their area, and we get 100% grants for work on the building, which of course when I went there, that was never in anyone's mind at all. So that was a providence of God, that was. What was your question?
Well, about the space in the building, because the church halls were pretty much derelict.
They were derelict. It was a shame, because it was quite a distinctive building, but it was all full of dry rot and everything. So
this is the building directly opposite the car park gates.
That's right.
Limehouse Church Institute.
That's right.
The facade is still there.
Yeah, yes.
But behind it is flats now.
That's right. My predecessors, that was the church hall where everything happened. Scouts, Cubs, midweek groups, bingo, all sorts happened there. But then by the time I got there, it was falling to bits. And in the end we sold it, so that we made all the use we could of what property we did have, mainly the rectory. So the rectory became a place for PCC meetings, Sunday school and so on. We also used corners of the church. The southeast corner became a room for, I forget where, that was the creche, but we had, but some of the children used to go over once they, in for the first part of the service, as a lot of churches have, and they would be taken over to the rectory for their teaching, and then come back for the end of the service and be welcomed at communion, if it was a communion service. Another sort of simple compromise, when we were talking about if St Matthias people come here, was that, well, St Matthias service was at 11 o'clock and the St Anne's one was at 10, so it didn't take a genius to work out we could have a service at 10:30, so we did.
As it is to this day, yes. I didn't know how we landed
so
on
that's how it came
10.
about.
Yeah.
And there was no evening service either.
Right.
So we brought that with us.
Yes.
That was a small but still lively, mainly I suppose in the 20s to 30s group, whereas the older people kept to the morning. Yeah.
And it was the evening service that Derek Cutler first came to in the 80s.
You want to tell? Yes.
He,
Well, could he tell
we'll hear
us
his story another time.
But it was the evening. Yes. Sorry, I'm just thinking about it. There was a time for open prayer. We didn't always have that, but we said if anyone's got a special request, and Derek, whom I didn't know at all, marched up to the front and said, "Yes, my son's in hospital with a stab wound. Will you pray for him?" And Rona prayed for him. And the fact that he was this foreign lady praying for his son was just overwhelming. At least that's what I remember. Yeah, there were different. We struggled a bit with different styles, and some wanted it more charismatic, some wanted more prayer book. But in the end, we jogged along for 12 and a half years. We were there.
You had a couple of bright young medical students arrive, the Buscombe, in the early 80s.
Oh gosh, yes, among others, yes.
Yes.
We tried not to lean too much on the 20s or 30s, but we did have a separate group for them that met during the week. But we tried to make sure it was local people who had as much say as anyone else, and more than most.
How would you sort of characterise the ministry that you were doing in the late 70s and 80s at St Anne's?
How would I characterise it?
You know, who were you looking to reach? How were you looking to reach them? How would it feel if we went into that church today?
Well, who were we looking to reach? Everybody, but we were concentrating on the local people who lived in council flats. In my time, there came a quite new development as the wharves on the riverside were bought up and made into luxury flats. We had a ministry there, but it was never our priority. We went visiting to these rich people, but it was around the council flats that we looked for our main ministry, and therefore it couldn't be too intellectual. It couldn't be too. Well, it was preachy. We believe in preaching and teaching the Bible, and we had home groups, and that was a key part of our ministry there. But to try and make sure there was a good mix. As it happened, I remember one PCC, we were discussing the police and the role of the police in the community. And what struck me, although it's only a small group, and it couldn't be taken as representative, but the white members of the PCC were wholly supportive of the police. The black and brown members were much more guarded because their sons had been not quite beaten up, but they had a very rough time at the hands of the police. And so there was that interesting division that we had to think about.
Wow.
And we tried to make sure that that the church was as balanced as we could make it without creating artificial sections.
It sounds very similar to what we're doing today.
We also set up what we call the think tank, which looked at issues we didn't really have space for on a Sunday, social concerns. But again, that was mainly through the 20s and 30s, and they met in their home. And I did I go? I think I went, yes, but not as the leader. I'd go as the guest if they wanted me. But then we're, what are you doing about race? What are you doing about this? Well, we've got a group that does work on that, but we can't do everything. You've got the what's it called? The mission opposite,
yes,
which was hostel for merchant navy cadets, And then it was sold and became, well, a slum really, so that we had John Pilger of the Daily Mirror down to demand that it be closed and demanding my support. Well, that was difficult because it was in such a state. But I married one couple who were living there, so we had a pastoral role there as well. And then I gather it's back into better hands now.
Is this the building directly across Newell Street?
Yes.
The former cadets' place.
Right.
Oh yes, I mean it's a very nice place now.
And one man who became quite a senior clergyman came to visit us and said, well, I was in the Merchant Navy and I lived there as a cadet, and that's why I heard God's call to ministry.
Wow.
And he spoke about how God had very vividly called him to service, full-time service. And that's right, he must have spoken in church on this.
Mm-hmm.
And one of our older ladies, Aggie, now with the Lord, took it all in, and she, to her lunch club, she went somewhere else during the week. She took his story and told all the other people there.
Wonderful.
So the word spread around.
Yeah.
It was quite remarkable. Oh yes, it was Aggie who in my predecessor's time, turned up at church when they did have an evening service, and it was cold and snowy, and nobody came except the rector, and the rector said to Aggie, I don't think anyone's coming, and she said, well, I've come. So she made him unlock and say some prayers with him. Aggie, who survived being bombed out, a bomb fell on her house. She survived the war, but then she was mugged in peacetime, crossing the churchyard. More questions?
Well, that makes me think, you told me about the time that, was it the milk was stolen and you chased someone over the churchyard wall?
Yes.
Yes,
that did happen.
Before the railings were put back
on
the churchyard. And tell me, we're speaking now in 2023, and we're starting to look ahead to our tercentenary in 2030,
yes.
When we hope to publish your book. But that's not
your book, yeah.
The book that you've done all the work on, New Life in Limehouse. Hope it sees the light of day. But you were the rector for the 250th anniversary.
Yes.
And how did you celebrate that?
Well, I think we started with, I haven't mentioned the Archdeacon much, have I?
No.
Well, now, George the Archdeacon was an old-fashioned high churchman. He opposed my going. He said he was under very great pressure. Well, I didn't feel any pressure at all, because I felt if they didn't want me, Worcester and Matthias are happy and popular. However, he realised he lost that battle. But I have to say, once I was there, he was very supportive. So I felt it was a good idea to kick off the anniversary year by asking him to come. And he did behave himself that time. So he started it. Then we had the actual anniversary was in the autumn, wasn't it? Was it September, October time? And we had, at that time, the only evangelical bishop, who was Maurice Wood, Bishop of Norwich. And I'd had links with him before. So he came and, well, he gave us the gospel, hot and strong. We had a big service with the school children came, and he gave out little invitation cards with the gospel on it. So that was part of it. I wrote a hymn to celebrate it, towering over road and river.
We still sing it.
It's amazing, that is. It's lasted well.
We still sing it, yeah.
And there were smaller events through the year, but the main focus was, well, once we started it, was the autumn, I think, with Maurice Wood's visit.
I don't want to create any sense of precedence, because I'm not going to follow your example, but you put a banner at the top of the tower, didn't you?
Oh yes. Well, now, one of the other evangelical churches I've mentioned was Christchurch Spitalfields. Now, they were founded a year before Limehouse. So they had got all the banners, well, a number of things ready for they've done their 250th years. And the next year we could borrow all their stuff. And one was a big canvas, bright yellow canvas banner that we took up, let's say we, because my sons helped me, took up the tower and draped it round the pillars at the top, which was quite scary, but it meant that, you know, the neighbourhood could see. Did I tell you about the blackboard?
No.
That wasn't part of our, so I didn't answer your question, but one Christmas, my visual aid was a big blackboard with the letters NOEL, which stands, as you know, for News of Eternal Life. You see, that was my sermon, family service. Well, I've used it once. Now, what am I going to do with it? I know, I'll take it up the tower. So I took this thing up the tower. It just about scraped it up the staircase with an inch to spare, and I put it on the roof so it could be seen in the winter when the leaves weren't on the trees. Wow. It could be seen from the flats across the road. So it stood NOEL. And that was good. And then, of course, it was there for perhaps as long as 3 weeks, but not longer than that. Christmas was over. So I thought, well, I'm not going to take it down. It's too difficult to squeeze, but I'll throw it down. So I got my son Tim to stand in the churchyard to make sure there was nobody there, and I threw it down from the top to land on the grass. Unfortunately, the wind, the air currents blew it not on the grass, but onto the stone round the church, the stone, so it scattered into a million pieces. So the warning is, when you throw blackboards off the top of the church, allow for the wind and the air currents.
I'll bear that in mind.
It's an important thing.
Thank you very much.
But if you do something round the top, make sure you're insured. I think I ought to say that. Yes.
I'm not sure you would have been. What did Marjorie say about it?
She said, when you go up the tower, just don't tell me you're going. Tell me when you come back. It's all right. And of course, we've had two great events, well, not quite disasters, but we had the fire, which I haven't mentioned.
No, tell us about the fire.
Well, that was a clear case of arson. We could almost point to the boys who lit the fire, but the police, for some reason, let us down. They never chased these lads up. And they started the fire in at least 3 different spots. And we'd just come back from a school pantomime at the Stepney Greencoat School, and a lady came running up the road and said, "Rector, the church is on fire." "What? Well, guess ring the fire brigade, quick." I don't know why she didn't, but they came just in time to save the organ. The fire had been burning, I think they said, for half an hour at least. But if it had gone for another half hour, we'd have lost the whole place. Like the 1850 fire, which is down in the records. So this fire has left, well, there's still black marks on the ceiling that we haven't got round to getting rid of yet. But we had a lot of support in that, and people, you know, around heard of the fire, and there was a couple due to be married on, this was on Thursday, a couple due to be married on Saturday, and I said, well, the church is in no state for a wedding. I'll get special permission, special Archbishop's license, what it was called, and you can be married in the next door church, St Dunstan Stepney. And they said, "Oh no, we can't, we're getting married." So the bride's family and friends all turned up with buckets and mops and everything the day before. So it was, although there were still chunks of soot coming from the roof, ceiling, they had their wedding with flowers, and it was lovely, really. So that got in the local paper. And then, of course, the big hurricane, which was what, 1989? I got it down here.
87 maybe.
7? Yes, I'm not very good with dates. Well, if you say so. And I was away in Scotland when that happened. But there was a big, heavy lead
Hatch.
hatch at the top of the tower,
Mm.
and it just blew right off as it was paper. Landed on in the churchyard. I'm glad nobody was underneath it.
Yeah.
At the time.
Yeah.
Interesting too, the trees.
Yes.
The trees that were planted in the grass survived. The trees on the tarmac all came down.
Hmm.
And they crashed, the trees that did come down crashed into the fairly new metal railings that GLC had put round the churchyard, as if they were just cardboard. The weight of a tree is just amazing.
Yeah.
So, as Jonathan, who was away at the time, wrote to say, a bit of a blow, wasn't it, really?
You lost a clock face as well, is that right?
So,
Did one of the faces of the clock?
oh yeah,
town
well
hall?
bits came off the
Yeah.
clock.
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
sorry that I did have a little collection in the South Gallery, but I'm afraid one of my successors decided that there was too much rubbish there and got rid of them. I'm sorry for that, because that was my little museum
Not guilty.
from the from the past.
Yeah. 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 So you moved on from St Anne's in what, 1989? Would it have
Yes.
been? 89. And you went on to a group of rural parishes.
I
in
did.
Suffolk.
Just before
Yeah,
I come
go
to
on.
that, if
Yeah.
I may, we
Yeah.
did appreciate the occasional ministry of students.
Mm.
We had students for the ministry from Oak Hill College
Mm.
and Ridley Hall, Cambridge,
Mm.
and they came either every Sunday or, much was more useful, staying for 3 or 4 weeks, so they saw the midweek things as well.
Right.
We also had a group from Oxford, where I was at college, from the Christian Union, and they spent 9 or 10 days for 4 or 5 years in succession, and that was terrific encouragement to them and to us. But yes, we moved on. I felt that London had enough of us, after all these years, and we said to the Lord, anywhere, we don't mind where we go, really. It could have been, we thought about Liverpool, we thought about Kent, but in the end it was an invitation that came from another archdeacon, he'd come into the story, with an opportunity in Suffolk.
And then you came back to London after that.
Yes.
And what did you do when you came back to London?
Well, I did bits and pieces, really. I helped with the Cornhill training course. That was only one afternoon a week, but it was quite interesting hearing mainly young people preach and giving an assessment of their sermons. And I did marking of what the words are going,
The Moore
correspondence
College.
course for the Moore College, which a lot of people did in that area.
Mm.
And I helped in local churches a little bit. I did school assemblies. I mean, that wasn't paid work, but I loved doing that. And that was in the Old Kent Road again, where the school where my first eldest two sons had started school. So I enjoyed that. And then in the year 2002, my dear Marjorie began to be ill, and it proved to be inoperable brain tumour, and she died the following spring, and that was the year I turned 65. So on my birthday I retired and I left London and retired to Bromley for 10 years, and now I'm here in Herne Hill for 10 years so far.
And a member of Grace Church Dulwich,
Yes,
and involved in St Mark's Kennington,
yes.
and blessing St Anne's Limehouse again from time to time, and
Well, it's yes. I always
Holy Redeemer Streatham.
when I come to Limehouse, I've said, looking back, there were things I wish I hadn't done, or I wish I had done, or I didn't do very well. But I never ever regretted coming here. I can say that.
That young vicar in Hackney that had encouraged you to keep your eye on Limehouse all those years earlier. What happened to him?
Well, funnily enough, dear old John, we kept in touch. We were part of a group of younger, in those days, clergy who used to meet for lunch and for prayer and study. And so John was, he was always in touch during my negotiation to go to St Anne's. He used to say, remember, it's nothing to do with, whatever to do with me. Well, of course, it had everything to do with him, really. But when the time came for me to go, he stepped up to the mark. So he became my successor, as well as the man who, under God, instrumental in my being there in the first place.
Praise God.
And things really took off when he was there. Well, John had gifts that I haven't got, but he kept up. He was on General Synod, and he kept up a wider ministry in the church, as well as having a very personal, devotional life and faith and evangelism. Yeah, so I looked up to John. John went to be with the Lord a few years ago.
And tell me, Chris, if you had the opportunity to say one thing to me as the current incumbent and to the congregation today, what would it be? I haven't warned you that I was going to ask you this question, but
What did it say to you or the congregation?
Either to me or to the congregation, or both.
To you, this isn't really fair, but you did ask me. I would say, hang in there, because you've set yourself a target, which many men would not have done, but you want to be there for the 300, don't you? Well, if that's God's will, I pray that you will have the stamina. I would say do pace yourself. We never had a sabbatical, but I think that can be a lifesaver. Hang in there. You'll have disappointments, you'll have failures, but you'll have the Lord with you. And you've got a family with you, which is lovely, with Jenny and children. The congregation, stick by your rector.
For as long as he's faithful and turf me out when I'm not.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I hope that won't ever happen.
I hope so too.
You've still got, in some form, Care for St Anne's or Friends of St Anne's,
absolutely.
which draws in people who are not in the congregation but are willing to help with their different expertise from outside, which is great. I was part of a team that produced a book called Psalm Praise. Versions, not of all the Psalms, but some Psalms and some prayer book canticles, songs. And we formed a little choir of youngsters to help us launch this book at Poplar, and then we brought it with us to Limehouse. It's past its, it gone by its date now, but it was nice to have it exploring ways of doing the Psalms. It's a shame we don't sing Psalms so much as we should. When I went to Poplar, I inherited a woman colleague called Mary Gamage, but she left after a year, I think. And after a bit of a gap, she was replaced by Wendy Byworth, who lived in Upper North Street. And she was my colleague for the rest of my time at Poplar, and then she worked with me for 1 year at Limehouse, and was much loved and a very caring person. After a year, she felt it was right to move on, and I agreed. She wanted and she moved to a church in near Orpington, but she had put off going to see the doctor when she had various pains, and when she did go finally, it was too late. So she had hardly any ministry in Kent, but she died within a year. And she asked me to preach at her funeral, which was very moving. So that was Wendy. She's much loved. She had, I think her name appears, it does appear in the crypt room, because it was a legacy from her that paid for some of the cost of that development.
I'll just say thank you very much, Chris, for sharing your reminiscences and for your ministry over many years. We're grateful to God for all that he's done.
Well, I'm grateful to God, but realise it could have been so much better. But thank you for your encouragement.
Thank you.
And my love to all the people at St Anne's.
Super. Thank you very much.